There's a moment in sports when something shifts, and you feel it before you can explain it. Not a championship win, not a record broken, just a quiet, undeniable signal that the landscape has changed forever. That moment arrived in women's tennis, not on a court, not during a match, but inside a boardroom somewhere, when a 147-year-old German car company looked at everything it had built over nearly 5 decades and decided to walk away from all of it for a 20-year-old girl from Quezon City. Her name is Alex. And if you haven't been paying attention to what's been happening around her, you need to, because the story isn't really about tennis anymore. It's about power, identity, and what happens when one human being becomes undeniable. Let's rewind to 1978, because this story only makes sense if you understand what was being dismantled. A 15-year-old named Tracy Austin showed up in Filderstadt, Germany, pigtails, braces, and this quiet intensity that made seasoned tennis insiders stop mid-conversation and just watch. Porsche was in that room. Something connected that day, something that would turn into one of the most loyal partnerships professional sport had ever seen. Not 5 years, not 10, but 47 consecutive years of investment in women's tennis. Think about what that actually means. Through every era, every personality shift, every commercial storm the sport went through, Porsche didn't blink. Navratilova dominating the 80s, Hingis rewriting the rulebook in the 90s, Sharapova turning the sport into theater, Kerber grinding out grand slams with quiet ferocity, Swiatek stacking titles in the modern era. Through all of it, Porsche stayed. They didn't just write checks. They built something. The Porsche Tennis Grand Prix in Stuttgart became Europe's oldest professional women's indoor tournament. When they moved it into the Porsche Arena in 2006, they literally put their name on the building. Players voted it their favorite tournament in its category 10 separate times. In 2025, 33,000 people packed that arena, the biggest crowd since before the pandemic. They ran talent programs, donated to local children's charities for every ace served, signed brand ambassadors like Emma Raducanu and Angelique Kerber. When Aryna Sabalenka walked into a Stuttgart press conference and said she wanted to finally win the Porsche that year, it didn't sound like a sponsored talking point. It sounded personal because that's what 47 years of genuine investment looks like. It becomes part of the culture. And then December 2025 arrived, and everything changed. Mercedes-Benz walked into the room and announced the largest single sponsorship commitment in the documented history of women's professional sport. Starting January 2026, the WTA Tour officially became the WTA Tour driven by Mercedes-Benz. Global title partnership, exclusivity across every tournament on Earth, net post signage in every city the tour visited. Billie Jean King herself called it transformative. This was the moment the WTA had spent decades building toward, the proof that investing in women's sport as an institution, not just chasing individual stars, was the commercially viable path. And technically, Porsche was protected. Stuttgart was their tournament. They'd funded it, organized it, named the arena. Mercedes couldn't touch that. But the broader identity, the most loyal sponsor in women's tennis, designation they literally carried on their own website, that now existed inside a tour that wore a 3-pointed star. Sources close to the negotiations confirmed that Mercedes' deal included provisions to eventually absorb Porsche's secondary partnerships at smaller tour events. The timeline was deliberately vague. The tension absolutely was not. So Porsche made a decision. Not a retreat, not a grudging concession, a pivot executed with the kind of speed that separates legacy builders from casual participants. And the direction of that pivot had a Philippine passport. 1 week before the announcement broke, Tennis 365 had published an industry analysis. One line in it reads like something written after the fact, but it wasn't. It said that Alex had yet to win a WTA title, hadn't cracked the top 20, but might already be the most attractive sponsorship option across all categories, all sports, all demographics. Not the most promising young player, not the most interesting Asian talent, the most attractive option. Full stop. Porsche's commercial team had been reading the same data. They reached out to her management through an approach that people inside her team described as architecturally precise, like whoever designed it had studied every previous negotiation around her and deliberately avoided every friction point those conversations had encountered. They weren't competing with Nike in apparel. They weren't bumping into Babolat on equipment. They weren't crowding Globe Telecom or BPI or the Milo partnership that had just launched in February at SM Mega Mall, where Milo Philippines described Alex as the most complete expression of their champion development philosophy. Porsche existed somewhere entirely different. Automotive prestige, European heritage, the exact intersection of speed, elegance, and competitive intensity that Ferry Porsche had built into the first 356 Roadster in an Austrian Sammelbach in 1948. Nobody else was standing in that territory. Nobody else could. And the number they put on the table was staggering. $200 million structured across a decade, covering brand ambassador responsibilities, a lifestyle collection, fragrance development, and a dedicated Southeast Asian market campaign. The largest individual athlete investment in Porsche's entire corporate history by a significant margin. Emma Raducanu had been an ambassador. Kerber had been an ambassador. Neither arrangement came anywhere close. All of it directed at one 20-year-old from Quezon City. When WTA leadership got wind of what was coming, the reaction wasn't measured concern. It was fury. And to understand why, you have to think carefully about the timing. Mercedes had just delivered the biggest sponsorship deal in women's sports history. The WTA had finally, after decades of advocacy, proven that institutional investment in the tour itself was commercially justified. And then Porsche stood up and said with its wallet, loudly and clearly, that the institution wasn't actually the product. The human being was the product. Think about what that means for everyone who built their careers on the collective investment argument. WTA officials who'd spent years convincing global brands that the tour deserved recognition, not just the stars within it, watched Porsche take 47 years of women's tennis identity and redirect it toward one player inside that tour. The concern was about what came next. If Porsche could do this, what stopped every other institutional partner from doing the same calculation? Why buy the tour when you could buy the athlete? Why invest in the framework when the framework's entire commercial value was derived from the players competing inside it? The anger was real, professionally legitimate, and completely understandable. It was also completely beside the point of what Porsche had actually decided. Because if you strip away the commercial warfare and the institutional fury and the officials checking their phones at 7 a.m. watching their narrative rewrite itself in real time, what you're left with is a girl from Quezon City who began 2025 ranked 140th in the world. She ended it ranked 50th. In between, she claimed her first WTA title in Guadalajara, her first Grand Slam main draw victory at the US Open, her first WTA 500 level final at Eastbourne. Her year-end reflection, posted not as a victory lap but as something closer to a love letter, was addressed to her family, her team, her supporters, and to baby Alex, the little girl who made an enormous choice that made the woman she's becoming possible. By February 23, 2026, she had reached a career-high ranking of 31. She had just beaten Jasmine Paolini, world number 7 in Dubai. That was her fourth top 10 victory, a statistical pace the WTA's own analysts described as historically premature for a player at her current ranking. She carried the Philippines flag at the 2025 SEA Games in Thailand, took gold in women's singles, bronze in mixed doubles. She led her country to a 5-0 sweep in the Billie Jean King Cup, personally undefeated, securing a promotion the Philippine Tennis Federation described as a generational milestone. Her Vogue Philippines cover, her Tatler Philippines cover, Globe Telecom signing her at 8 years old because someone there saw something, Nike commissioning a Sampaguita hair tie for her Wimbledon debut, a national flower detail that wasn't generic branding but a genuine acknowledgement of her cultural identity. She competed in Milo Sports Clinics as a child and returned as their ambassador in 2026, not as a transaction but as the living proof of what that program was always meant to create. And here's something that tells you everything about the intensity surrounding her. Verifiles and Rappler spent months fact-checking fabricated sponsorship stories because her fan community's emotional investment in her recognition consistently outpaced what verified commercial reality had yet delivered. People were inventing fake endorsements because the real ones felt too small for who she was becoming. Think about that for a second. Gigi Salmon, Sky Sports' lead presenter, said it plainly at a London tennis industry gathering. In terms of her appeal, the crowds that follow her, she might already be the biggest star. Coco Gauff, whose own commercial portfolio is one of the most sophisticated in women's sport, publicly referenced the Federer phenomenon, that specific dynamic where when you play a certain kind of star, a significant portion of the crowd didn't primarily come to watch you. Porsche cited both observations in their internal justification documents. They cited the 33,000 in the Porsche arena. They cited Southeast Asia's luxury market trajectory. They cited the verified reality that a fan community producing viral fake endorsement stories at that volume represents a commercial intensity no manufactured campaign could ever replicate. Sky Sports, Coco Gauff, Tennis 365, Porsche's own analysts, all arriving at the same conclusion through completely different routes.
And Porsche moved.
What they purchased wasn't a legacy already written. It was a legacy still being written. Now the WTA officials had every structural reason for their frustration. Large institutional partnerships require coherent stakeholder ecosystems to generate projected returns. The Mercedes arrangement deserved the aligned commercial environment that would allow it to function at the level it was designed for. Their concerns were legitimate. They were also arguing about frameworks, while Porsche was arguing about something older and ultimately more powerful than any framework the WTA has ever built. Because at its core, this decision had nothing to do with Mercedes. Nothing to do with title partner exclusivity clauses or protected tournament agreements or the complicated politics of a Stuttgart arena. It had to do with a 20-year-old who looked into a camera in Dubai and said, "How many people would love to be in my position? I make it a point every day to really give my all and be grateful for what I have." It had to do with a girl who stood at Indian Wells and said with quiet certainty, "I know that I belong here." Not performed confidence, not rehearsed media training, just a statement from someone who has sat alone with the work long enough to know what it has produced. It had to do with the athlete who looked back at the most explosive breakthrough year any Philippine tennis player had ever experienced and chose to describe it not as a commercial triumph, not as a professional vindication, but as a love letter. Porsche didn't abandon women's tennis. Porsche relocated its investment from an institution to a human being and chose the human being whose story most completely justified that relocation. The 47 years weren't wasted. They were preparation for recognizing this moment when it arrived. The officials angry about this decision were fighting about territory. Porsche was fighting about legacy, about the specific kind of legacy that attaches to a name rather than a logo, to a person rather than a platform, to a story still unfolding rather than a history already documented. So here's where I leave you, and I want you to actually sit with this before you answer. When one of the most historically loyal automotive sponsors in professional sport walks away from 47 years of institutional commitment to place everything on one 20-year-old from the Philippines, is that the most commercially rational decision in the history of women's sports sponsorship? Or is Porsche simply the first major corporate entity with the courage to say out loud what everyone watching Alex already understood? That some athletes don't belong to institutions. Some athletes transcend them. And the moment you're standing in front of one, everything else, every framework, every exclusivity clause, every decades-long partnership becomes secondary to the simple, overwhelming fact of who she is. Leave your answer below. Because when we come back to this story in 5 years, it's either going to look like the most brilliant commercial instinct the sport has ever seen, or confirmation of something even more remarkable than that.